Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to our session of the Islam Study Circle. Uh, I will read out the Quranic verses that we have to study today. These verses have been picked from the 75th surah of the Quran, which is Surah Qiyamah. And the title that I've given these verses is Human Conscience and the Day of Judgment. So the verses begin like لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة أيحسب الإنسان أن لن نجمع عظاما بلى قادرين على أن نسوي بنانا بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أماما يسأل أيان يوم القيامة فإذا برق البصر فخسف القمر وجمع الشمس والقمر يقول الإنسان يومئذ أين المفر كلا لا وزر إلى ربك يومئذ المستقر ينبأ الإنسان يومئذ بما قدم وأخر بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة ولو ألقى معاذيره. By no means I present the very day of judgment as evidence to it, and by no means I present as the rebuking soul evidence, the soul within you as evidence. Does man think that we shall not be able to bring together his bones? Why not? We can put together the sections of his very fingertips or of his fingers. In fact, man wants to be mischievous before his conscience. He asks when will the day of judgment be? But on the day when the sight is dazed, the moon eclipsed, and the sun and the moon are brought together, he will say, whither to flee? No, there is no refuge now. Towards your Lord that day is the resting place. On that day man will be informed what he sent forth and what he left behind. In fact, he himself is a witness upon his own self, however much he may put up excuses. So, dear viewers, basically these verses are substantiating the day of judgment. The fact that there is going to be a day of judgment is something which these verses say is so evident that our own soul, our own conscience bears witness to it. And just before I explain this, let me just explain a small grammatical point here. As you can see that the surah begins with the negation. It says, no, I swear by the day of judgment. So whenever this negation occurs in this form before an oath, it generally is meant to negate something. And if it is as if the people are not listening to some obvious premise, and that thing is then said, that what you're supposing or thinking as a hypothetical thing is certainly not the case. The case is in fact that I present the day of judgment as a witness to its own self. This, in other words, means that the day of judgment is such an apparent thing, it is such an obvious thing, that no external witness is required to know or to substantiate that it is going to occur. And then the verses go on to say that the compuncting soul, or the soul which rebukes us, which of course refers to our conscience, it is enough evidence that the day of judgment is going to take place. So you see, this obvious question which arises in us is that if we have this conscience in us which rebukes us for every bad deed we do, and also it applauds us for the good deeds we do, then there has to be some truth to it. Why has someone placed his conscience in our own selves? Why is it that we like to do good deeds? And why is it that we like that good deeds should always have favorable results and evil deeds should not have favorable results? We do see that in this world it is not always the case. Many a time we intend good, but the result is evil, or result is not congruous to what we have done, and vice versa. So this brings a question to our mind, that if we have a conscience in our own selves which rebukes us for bad deeds, which praises us for good deeds, and when we see the outside world, and we see that in the outside world good deeds are not always applauded and they don't always have a good result, and vice versa is the case with evil deeds. They are not always condemned, and they are not always put to shame. In fact, many a time evil is lauded, and it has a very strong place and a very high place in the society. So there is this contradiction. Our own conscience tells us that good deeds should result in good results or good consequences, but this is not the case. So this shows that there is something else which is missing to this world. And it is here that the Quran tells us, and of course our own conscience is an evidence of this, that this world is not going to be an end in itself. Because our own soul tells us, our own conscience tells us that there is something more to it. Had there been nothing else, then why is it the Creator placed this semi court of justice in ourselves? It means that there has to be a greater court of justice set up one day in which people will be judged according to the deeds, and the good shall actually end up with a good fate, and the evil shall actually end up with an evil fate. So this is what the Quran actually tells us, that because of the fact that this world, or in this world, results are not always congruous or in harmony with the deeds. They are not in accordance with their deeds. Hence, there has to be some other world in which deeds or intentions and deeds produce congruous results. Good deeds and good intentions should actually be rewarded, and bad deeds and bad intentions should be punished. So this is a very important evidence which the Quran has presented. Of course, we know that the biggest thing, or the biggest belief that all of us have to contend and all of us to face exactly is the belief in the hereafter. So belief in the hereafter is something that is substantiated by the Quran in various ways. So it presents historical evidence, it presents the evidence of previous prophets, it presents the evidence of the incompleteness of this world, and here you can see that it presents the evidence of our reproaching soul, our rebuking soul, our conscience, that the Day of Judgment is a reality. One cannot forget the Day of Judgment, because this smaller Day of Judgment, which we find in our own selves at the micro level, has to have some external justification, has to have some external manifestation. And the external manifestation, which these verses actually imply, is that a greater Day of Judgment is ought to come. And again, as you can see from these verses, because they primarily address the first and the foremost addressees of Mecca, which of course are the idolaters. So the word al-insan, although is used in a general way, but in the context we can clearly see that the people of the Quraysh have been addressed, and it is their belief which is actually criticized and critically reviewed here. And when the words are said that bal yuridul insanu liyafjura amama, the actual implication is that these people of the Quraysh, they think that once they die and become dust and decay, they will not be raised to life again. This is something of some belief which we know that has been presented all over in the Quran, and the idolaters of Arabia always used to think that death is all that is that's going to finish them. This life is all that there is, and if ever there's going to be an hereafter or a Day of Judgment, then their own deities will be able to plead before the Almighty for their salvation. And it is here that they are put to shame, and they are said that these people actually, when they say these words, they are denying the evidence of their own conscience. It's their own conscience which tells them that there has to be a greater Day of Judgment. And they, as these verses go on to say, that they actually play a prank before their own conscience when they say that how can we raise to life again, and how is it that once we die we will be resurrected again. You can see that these words are clearly very emphatic when they say balil insanu ala nafsihi basira walau alqa ma'azira, that every human being knows from his inside there has got to be some accountability. There's got to be some questioning that has to be done, because of the fact that we have been blessed with so many things, and because of the fact that our inner conscience rebukes us for the evil that we do. So you can see that the Quran at this place has presented our rebuking self, our human conscience, in evidence, in support of the fact that this smaller place of judgment in our own hearts, in our own soul, actually testifies to a greater Day of Judgment, which will one day take place, and hence we have to be extremely careful about it. Now, viewers, we go on to the next part of our study session, which is a hadith, and this hadith actually relates to a very commonplace etiquette, which is the etiquette of sneezing. What should we do when we sneeze, and how people who hear us respond to our sneeze should themselves respond. So this narrative has actually been taken from the Al-Jami al-Sahih of Imam Bukhari. Let me read out its text before you. So it says, An Abi Huraira radiallahu anhu an Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam قال إذا عطس أحدكم فليقل الحمد لله وليقل له أخوه وصاحبه يرحمك الله فإذا قال له يرحمك الله فليقل يهديكم الله ويصلح بالكم. So Abu Huraira reported that the Prophet said, when any one of you sneezes, he should say Alhamdulillah, of course, which means gratitude be to God. And if his brother or companion hears these words, he should reply by saying, Yarhamukallah, may God have mercy on you. And when he hears the words Yarhamukallah from his companion or from his person who is near him, he himself, the person who sneezes, should actually reply by saying, Yahdikumullah wa yuslih balakum, which means may Allah guide you and keep you well. So this is something, dear viewers, wherever we are, especially followers of Abrahamic religions, they know that this disruption of our body in which we sneeze is such a big relief to us, because all of us know that once this sneezing procedure or this sneezing has ended, we find a very big relief in our bodies. And it is on this big relief that we thank the Almighty and we say Alhamdulillah. And such strong is this tradition, and such all pervasive is this tradition, that we find that all Abrahamic faiths actually vouch for it. And whenever we see people sneezing, other people of Abrahamic faiths, all of us might have very commonly seen that they say bless you, which of course is the same as Alhamdulillah. And it's just the words which are different. We say these words in Arabic. Otherwise, it's exactly the same tradition which we follow. And the reason is that we thank God even for a thing as small as a sneeze. It might look very small, but in fact, it is a very, very huge relief, because the disruption which comes about in our body, imagine if we are not able to sneeze. Imagine if our sneeze gets stuck. It will be such a big issue for us. We will be really, really constrained and very, very disturbed in our routine. So when we give up the sneeze, when we let out the sneeze from us, it gives us this big relief. And it is on this big relief that we thank God that He made this possible, which of course emphasizes the fact that thanking God even on small things or things which are similar in nature is only befitting for human beings. Whenever we come across some blessing of the Almighty, because ultimately, of course, all blessings are, the source of all blessings is God. At times these blessings reach us through other means, for example, through our parents, maybe through our various gadgets. But if you work back, we can ultimately see that all these have actually resulted because of that God-gifted intellect which the Almighty has given us. He has given us this intellect to produce things, to invent things. He is the being who has given us our parents, and hence if we receive any benefit from them, ultimately its real source is the Almighty Himself. And then look how the Prophet has actually told us that this etiquette is such a beautiful etiquette in our society, that when a person says Alhamdulillah when he sneezes, a person who might be near him, maybe a man or a woman or anyone, he is expected to respond to this Alhamdulillah by saying Yarhamukallah, may God have mercy on you. So you can see that if a person says Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, and in return the person who is his companion, he or she says may God have mercy on you, the ties of mutual fraternity, the ties of mutual friendship, the ties of mutual concern, they get stronger. And whoever is in our company is actually requested or asked by the Prophet to reply by these words, Yarhamukallah. And then you can further see that the Prophet has prescribed that when that person says Yarhamukallah, the first person, who is the person who actually sneezed, he is requested to say Yahdikumullah wa yuslih balakum, may God guide you and keep your affairs well and tidy. So you see this mutual exchange of greetings, this mutual exchange of connecting to God is so apparent in this small phenomena which we call sneezing, that we can clearly see that the Almighty wants us to connect to Him through these words, and also to connect between us ourselves by replying and responding to these words, and which actually tell us that how concerned we are when we see our fellow human being relieved from a stress. And when he says or she says, Alhamdulillah, and we respond by saying, May God have mercy on you, it's a mutual exchange of supplication. It's a mutual exchange of praying for each other that has taken place. And it actually has this ring of tremendous sympathy for one another, tremendous concern for one another, and the fact that things have to be acknowledged, things have to be responded to. So another lesson that we learn from this is that at times we do appreciate a lot of things, but we don't express this appreciation through words. So this supplication or this hadith also teaches us this, that we have to express the appreciation or the gratitude that we may feel. And if we feel this gratitude for the Almighty when we say thank you to Him because of the fact that He has relieved us, it teaches us that we have to do this to everyone to whom we come in contact with, because if they have been of any utility to us, of any benefit to us, then it's our right to thank them, and it's our right to respond to whatever they have done. So this action and its reaction, this deed and its response is like a human bond which is strengthened every time that human beings have go through such a routine. And hence we find that this is something which really is so helpful and so a cause of such a strong bond between us. And as we've already said this and discussed this a number of times, and we have to remember that, and time and again we need to remind ourselves that humanity is our first religion. Before we are Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists, we are human beings. And as human beings, we have to bond together. And as human beings, we have to reach out for each other. As human beings, we have to provide our shoulders to others. And as human beings, we have to encourage and appreciate others. And as I said, that humanity comes first. A person who's not a good human being is likely not to be a good religious person, a person who follows any religion. So let's make this effort of becoming good people, good human beings first, and then, of course, we will be helped, and not only be helped, but of course our brethren will be there to reach out for us whenever we are in distress. And similarly, we would also expect our own selves to do the same and reciprocate in this way. Viewers, now next move on to the next part of our first section, and that is the Bible verse of the day. The verse that I have selected is a very famous verse of the Bible, taken from the Sermon of the Mount, and it's verse 7 of the Gospel of Saint Matthew, in chapter 7. It says, "Make a request and it will be answered. What you are searching for, you will get. The sign in the door will be open to you." And the title that I've given this is "Seek and Thou Shalt Find." So you can clearly see that the Prophet Jesus is telling us that if we are true in our quest for the truth, if we are true in our pleading, if we are true in our invocation, we are bound to be answered by the Almighty. Make a request and it will be answered. What you are searching for, you will get. Give the sign and the door will open to you. Which of course means that we have to try as much as we can to find out the way to the truth, the path to the truth. Is something that we have to look for. It's our responsibility, it's our obligation to go as far as we can in this. And if we are lucky and sincere in our truth, and we of course in this quest, and we are also absolutely certain that we are very sincere to our cause, the Prophet Jesus has given us these glad tidings that every such call will be answered. And when the words answered here are written as such, it always does not mean that they shall be answered the way we would like them to be answered. At times, silence is also an answer. At times, some different answer is also an answer. So these are all possibilities. At times, you make a request and the request is fulfilled in some other manner, which of course means that the Almighty has some other plans. But the bottom line is, what we have always learned when we are growing up, that try and try again, never give up. We have to be people who carve out our own destinies by working hard, by doing our own due, by praying to God once we have done our part. So you see, when we pray to the Almighty to grant certain of our wishes, then we have to do the needful first. For example, if we would like to succeed in an exam, it will not be of any worth or any consequence to pray to the Almighty without actually working hard for the exam, or without plowing the field and sowing a seed. If we ask God to sprout forth or make a plant sprout forth, that's not going to happen. So what the wherewithal or the preparation before the prayer is to be answered, something which belongs to our own domain, has to be made. We have to do our own due and then pray to God. If we have this sincere quest, if we have this sincere thirst for the truth, and we go about finding this truth as much as we can, it is only then that the Almighty is going to shower His blessings and answer, if He may, through His own means. So it is ourselves that we have to take upon and, and proceed in this manner. And one of the very important things that we need to learn in life, and which I personally have learned, is that destination is not something that is in our control. Whether we reach a destination or not is something which depends on so many variables. But working hard, expending our effort, trying enough is something which is always in our control. So let's not be slack in that. Whether we reach our destination or not, as I said, depends on a lot of variables, and of course the will of God as well. But as far as trying hard is concerned, that is something that we can always do. And that is something we must always review, whether we have worked hard, whether we have tried hard enough for what we are actually aspiring for. So trying, putting in our own effort, trying as hard as we can is something which is in our domain. And when we actually work in our domain, we remain in our domain, we actually remain in our own bounds, which in other words is the definition of taqwa. Taqwa in the Quran means to understand our limitations and to remain within our own bounds and not step into the bounds of the Almighty. And when we try to produce results, then here we often make a lot of compromises. So instead of trying to produce results, because producing results is the sphere or the domain of the Almighty, trying hard is our own domain. That is the domain we must try to restrict ourselves and not cross over into the domain of the Almighty by pushing hard to produce results, because as we all know that producing results is something which is not in our hands. So viewers, with these words we come to an end to this first section of our study circle, and if you have any questions, please proceed to ask them, and you can raise your hands as well. And in case there are no questions, then we shall proceed to the next part of our study circle. So I see Yasin Fahad Sahiba. Let me just unmute your mic. Please go ahead with your question.
Assalamualaikum. Dr. Shehzad, I wanted to ask about what you said right now, that don't try to produce results because it is not our domain, and I understand. But how would you know that you have reached a point where you're trying to cross your domain and getting into the Almighty's domain? Like maybe you are still thinking that you are trying your best, right? So maybe you did what you could. Like let's say you applied for a job, you send your resume, whatever, and then later on you probably approach somebody who knew someone in that organization, to put some pressure there. So how would I know if doing that is crossing my boundary? Should have just stopped at just sending my resume and then praying to Allah. Like this is just an example, but I'm trying to understand if you can explain that.
Right. You see, the best way to understand this is that we have to restrict ourselves to the preparation of our objective. For example, the job scenario which you just presented, in that we have to do our best to qualify for that job, and then of course send our application, and that's the end of that. When, for example, you're not chosen for the job, you're not selected for the job, and you fret and you complain and you start to brood and you get disappointed, it is here that you start challenging or maybe showing your dissatisfaction on the results which were produced by the Almighty. So this is one example in which we cross our domain. Instead of doing our best and leaving the rest to God, we not only do our best, but we expect that God would do the same as we would expect Him to do. So that's not always the case. So one of this area is that we, once we see the result which is not congruous to our own liking, we start to brood and complain, and then of course there is another chance that we might change, or we might try to alter the result by, I'm not talking about any specific person, but as an example, that when people see that results are not congruous to what they thought or what to think, they try to change them by maybe bribing people, or maybe trying to alter some of the other areas by illegally trying to enter a certain area, which of course they were not qualified for. So we have to accept that once you did your best and you left the rest to God, that is the result that came, they are not in our own control, and hence we have to accept them. And then similarly, we do have many other areas in which actually we try to adopt a shortcut. So one example that another example that I can give is that instead of giving a certain process its due course, we look for shortcuts, and these shortcuts actually are meant to not to work hard or to adopt a proper way, but to buy time and to, for example, produce results in our own lives. For example, there are certain things which only if we do, our next generations are going to reap their results. If we work hard, if we create a system in our country which is going to be beneficial, we might not live to see the results of that system. Our children will, or maybe our grandchildren will. And if we make compromises by trying to those results to see the daylight before their actual time, you see the thing at the back of our mind is that we want those results to be seen by our own selves in our own lives. And this not always is the case. And for this, we have to make a lot of compromises. And hence, we need to understand that such compromises actually produce frustration, they produce a lot of bad taste in people, and of course, they also, at times, are also instrumental in producing injustices in the society. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of our study circle, and this, of course, is a misconception that we generally study, or a small topic that we often think is part of our scriptural knowledge or theology, and generally it is not. And the topic that I'm going to discuss or maybe raise today is the issue of prisoners of war, and because there has been this in growing discontent and a lot of skirmishes between our two neighboring countries, India and Pakistan. We do have a lot of questions in our mind vis-a-vis religion, of course, and then there are a lot of questions which relate to our foreign policy, and a lot of questions which relate to our bilateral relations. I'm not going to touch upon the diplomatic or the political side of this interaction, or this unpleasant situation which is going on between India and Pakistan today. But what I would like to express here is a religious statute regarding prisoners of war, which the Quran has stated very unequivocally. And I have discussed this perhaps earlier also, that when the Quran was actually trying to end slavery, the first directive it gave was to forbid new slaves from coming into being, and that was because the biggest source of slavery, or one of the biggest sources of slavery in those times, was prisoners of war. So prisoners of war would be caught in wars and they would be enslaved. And then when they would be enslaved, they would be distributed among the people who would win or conquer the other army, and women who would be caught in such areas and in such skirmishes, they would become slave women for the conquering army, and then they would actually subject them to all sorts of things, which of course includes a sexual intervention as well, and sexual relations with them as well. So I have been seeing a lot of pictures on the Facebook, and a lot of things which are being presented on the social media, in which Muslims actually present Indian women on Facebook pages. Some of them are actresses, some of them are merely perhaps hypothetical images, and they say that they're going to capture these women in this war if it comes about, and then of course, they'll make them their slaves. I have actually explained this a number of times, but before, in fact, I go on and explain more, the other thing also that I would like to say is that the Quran has, when I said that the Quran has put an end to any new prisoners of war or any new method of slavery by saying that whenever you capture someone, you have to free that person either on ransom or as a favor without taking any ransom. Or, in other words, if that person is not guilty of any war crime, in which case, of course, he can be tried. But if he's a simple prisoner of war, then the Quran says that he has to be released. Imma mannam ba'du wa imma fida'an, which means that a prisoner of war, he has to be set free. He cannot be made a slave. He cannot be distributed among the conquering army in any way. And we have been discussing this earlier on as well, that when Islam put an end to slavery, it was, of course, this end that it made, that people could not be captured as slaves in wars. And hence, these images of Indian women and actresses splashed upon the internet as women who would be caught if there is a war and then they shall be subjected to sexual slavery is an absolute misconception, is a total mockery of what Islam stands for. It has absolutely no role in this. We have explained this earlier, that slavery was inherited by Islam in its own times, and it made gradual efforts to eliminate and abolish this institution. These gradual efforts were made in the strata of the society, in the various sections of the society, keeping in view those circumstances. And during that interim period, when slavery was not totally abolished, it was actually tolerated for a particular period of time, so that gradually this evil is exterminated. Of course, this was possible, but even at that stage, when in Medina, the time of the Battle of Badr, which was the first formal battle between the Muslims and the idolaters, when the time for that battle arrived, the Quran unequivocally announced that prisoners of war could not be enslaved. Prisoners of war could not be at any cost, except, of course, as I said, if they were war criminals or guilty of war crimes, they could be tried through a proper court of justice. But other than that, they could not be made slaves. And in this way, Islam actually ended, or took the first step in ending the, the ignominious institution of slavery which it had inherited. So, Muslims would do well if they once again study the Quran and some of its directives, which clearly say that slavery of all kinds is finished, and any such sexual slavery which our Muslims are imagining if there is a war, God forbid, and I don't foresee any such thing, but our concepts have to be put right as well. And if we Muslims think that capturing women in wars and making them slaves and indulging in sexual relations with them is something which is condoned by religion, then we are absolutely mistaken. In fact, we are totally mistaken, and we must reform our concepts. We must put them in line, bring them in line with the Quran. And the Quran has, in the very end, when slavery was abolished or was totally outlawed in the land of Arabia, had said that every slave man or woman who wanted to liberate himself or herself by actually vouching for the fact that he or she will not become an economic burden on the society has to be set free. The words of the Quran are fakatibuhum. Mukatabat has to be done with them. Mukatabat is a contract between the slave and the master, in which the master sets free the slave on the condition that he or she will not become an economic burden on the society and will earn for himself or herself. And of course, this was something of a ticket towards emancipation, which the Quran itself handed in the hands of the slaves. So, with these words, I'd like to make this clarification that any entertainment of this thought that Muslims can capture slave women, women in wars and then make them their slaves, is absolutely misplaced, and it's a big misconception, and we must try to resolve this misconception at our own levels. So, with these words, if you have any questions, please go ahead. So it seems that, do we have any question?
Yes, Dr. Shehzad, I have a question for you.
Ji, please go ahead.
Just wanted to ask, one of my friends, she is having the Ayat Karima with for her daughter. I know you have talked about it before, and I don't want to go and attend, but like, how should we deal with it? Like, I feel bad not going and being there for her, but then on the other hand, I don't like. I
Right.
told her that because I'm not comfortable with this whole idea, I won't be there,
Hmm.
and then, but you know what I mean? Like, she's a friend, she
Right. I do
understands, but
understand.
sometimes it's relatives, and it's much more sensitive. So
Yeah.
how we
So
approach
you
the
see, the
issue,
best
like,
the best way to respond to all such things is, of course, when the event is going to happen. It's That's not the right time to present your own opinion. In normal days, because this is something of a very commonplace tradition amongst Muslims, that they do this Ayat Karima reading and read it over and over again, thinking that this is going to be a remedy for the sufferings, or maybe a remedy for some of the problems that they are facing. You have to ask them that where have they obtained this practice from. And you know what? More often than not, this discussion will end up by simply saying, "Oh, I heard it from my parents, or my dadi, or my nani, or maybe from my uncle or aunt." Because there is no such thing found in our original sources, neither in the Quran nor in any authentic hadith, which says that Ayat Karima, if it is read over and over again, it's like a remedy to some of our problems. There is no such thing found anywhere in our sources. So the best way is to politely ask people in normal situations that this Ayat Karima, the way we read it, and it has become a fashion and a custom in Muslim societies, we need to ask this question to our own selves, that where has this practice originated, because it's not found in the earliest sources of our religion. And we actually should confront that person in a very polite way and ask him or her to find out that where this has come from. And if there is some origin, then the thing is that he or she should come up with a Quranic verse or a Hadith narrative which tells us that reading the Ayat Karima is something of benefit to all of us. So it's like,
because you mentioned that before, I did tell her that the Ayat Karima, if you look at the translation of it, it has nothing to do with the Shifa, because her daughter is, ever since she's born, she's in hospital for
mhm,
last 5 months.
mhm,
So I told her, if you want to do something, make dua for her
mhm,
that would have the Shifa aspect in it. And she's okay, she understands, but her
mhm.
dad wants it to be done, so she's doing it. But like, my concern was more like, how would you excuse yourself? Like, in this case, I was okay because she's a friend and she understands, but I know my very close relatives do it too. And I just fear that one day they will ask me to come, and they might be very
Well,
upset if I
if
say
you
I
it's
don't
there's no
believe.
harm in going. You can always go there. You can just sit there maybe and make dua your own self, but you don't have to participate in the ceremony. I mean, people, if they are reading, you can just go and sit there silently, maybe read some of your own duas, because if you're there, it might be a means of consolation or sympathy for them. So going there and sitting there is, I think, is not a problem. The only thing is, perhaps you should not participate in that reading out, and instead you can do your own dua if that can help them.
Okay, that's good. I think that's a good way of handling it. I
Right.
was just worried if we should be there or not
Yeah, there's no
at
harm in
that
being
point
there
in
if you're
time.
not.
Like,
You've already conveyed that orally to her, and now that you're going is basically uh, for sympathizing with her. So there is no harm in going there and reading something of your own.
okay, thank you so much.
Okay. So I have Rafia Khwaja Sahiba.
Dr. Shehzad, can I?
Right. Yes.
Yeah,
Please go
Dr.
on.
Shehzad, I have one or two questions.
Right.
Yeah, my first question is, if Allah sent the same deen to Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Prophets Nuh, Ibrahim, Musa, and Isa,
Mm-hmm.
then why do we have so much differences in our belief? And the second is that was the Sharia during the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam time only for the Muslims? This is one question, and then I have another question after that, if you don't mind.
Okay. So, as far as religion is concerned, of course, the Quran itself is very clear in many of its verses when it says that it sent the same religion to all the prophets of God. And in the Dina, in the Law Islam, religion has always remained as Islam, whether it was presented by Adam or Noah or by Jesus or by Moses or by Muhammad. All of them presented Islam, and all of them basically are religions which God sent forth. And this is why we have been asked to believe in all prophets of God, because they brought the same religion. The only thing is that some of the areas of the previous religions, they got distorted, especially in their historical aspects. Even today, if you study the Torah, for example, the book of Deuteronomy, which is of course called the Revised Canon, you'll find that what is written in it is very, very close to the Quran. Of course, it's a translation of the original work, but even then it is very close to the Sharia and of course the other things which are presented in the Quran, and there are very minor differences. The fact that this religion was meant for all of us, starting off in Arabia, is apparent in the Quran when it says that it has been sent not only to the idolaters but to all other denominations. The people of the book who were there, the Christians and the Jews, it was meant for them as well. And it was to them that the Prophet presented religion. We know that in Mecca he presented this religion to the idolaters. In Medina, his addressees were the Jews and the Christians, or the people of the book. So they were equally liable to accept it, and the only excuse they could have had was they were still trying to understand it, and to a certain extent. But that too, in the case of the prophets of God, especially the God's messengers, they are, because they are destined to deliver the truth in a conclusive way, such that the addressees are left with no excuse to deny it. They are made absolutely clear, and their own conscience bears witness to it. It is then that the prophets of God or messengers of God at times deal harshly with their addressees when they deny the truth deliberately. So yes, the answer to the second part of your first question is that every person who was there in Arabia, of course, there were three types of people who were there: the Jews, the Christians, the idolaters, and to some extent the Sabians, who were there in a minority. So all of them were obligated to obey the new religion brought by. Of course, the word "new" here does not mean new; it means a fresh version of the original religion, which had become distorted and interpolated, was revealed.
The second question was that the Sharia which the Prophet brought, was it only for the Muslims, or did it apply to everybody else?
As I said, that
and following is that, and the other thing I wanted to know is that then when the Quran is the last book, did it come and clarify that it accepted there were certain things of Torah and Injil which were also in the Quran, and it also corrected some of the wrong beliefs which the people believed in the previous books, which they had distorted?
Right. So as far as the Sharia being other religions being obliged to obey the Sharia is concerned, they were only obliged when they accepted Islam. Of course, when they did not accept Islam, until the time they did not accept Islam, and they had to obey the Torah or the Injil on which they were following, but they were liable to give it a serious thought, and they were told that they are left with no excuse to deny this new religion. And if they do so, this would be out of sheer arrogance and deliberate intent. So yes, they were liable to follow the new religion. Of course, the only exception was during the time of that presentation, in which they were trying to understand the stance of Islam. And as far as your second question is concerned, yes, again the answer is that we have to be very selective and choosy in this regard. And as far as religion is concerned, it was the same. And if there was a difference between any of these institutes, as I said, it was primarily because of the preservation of scriptures. Previous scriptures had not been preserved in their original language, and the reason also is very apparent, and that was because prophets of God were continuing to come, because of the fact that on the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, religion was going to end. So therefore, the final message of God had to be preserved, because no further prophet was coming, so that if there was any correction to be made, he could have made it. So that is why the Quran was preserved as the last book.
Can I ask one more question, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
My question is that, am I correct in understanding that if there is a case in the court in the Islamic society, two women are required as witnesses compared to one man. Is why is that? Is this because women are less intelligent, or is there something else in this?
So I think we've discussed this many times before as well, but I'll just summarize my answer once again that at no place in the Quran does it say that for criminal cases or for cases in which testimony is required, there is going to be any difference between a man and a woman. This is not the case anywhere in the Quran. As far as testifying as witnesses in a criminal case or in any case in which a woman is present as a witness, there is absolutely no difference between a man and a woman as long as a judge is satisfied with the testimony. The case which the Quran mentions is entirely different, and that is when the selection of a witness is your own choice. So there is one case in which circumstances select a witness. Of course, when there is a crime, circumstances select who is going to be there. But when I have this opportunity of selecting a witness, for example, on a document, it's always the case that I generally would like or not like maybe my sister or my mother or my daughter to be dragged into a court procedure if there is a dispute. I would always prefer to have male witnesses. So this is like giving this selection your own choice that if you would like, should have women witnesses. And because of the fact that in those Arab societies of which the Quran is representing that Quranic verse, women were generally not very used to coming to these court procedures, and they would often get confused. And so therefore it was said that in these circumstances, when women are more prone to some of the other work that they are doing, so if they would like to come, you could bring another lady with her, and so that if the first falters, the second could remind us. And again, you can see this testimony cannot be related to 2:1, because if the first is going to falter and the second is going to remind her, then again the witness is just one lady, because the lady who was forgotten, she should be subtracted. The one who is reminding her is the real witness. So that again is one. So it's one against one. So it's also to be interpreted in this way that the way two witness issue is presented in the Quran, first of all, it does not relate to criminal instances. It relates to your own choice when you would like to make a witness. And here again, it's not that the two witnesses is going to be equivalent to a one man witness. No, because when a woman is going to falter in her testimony and the other woman is going to perhaps remind her, again it's a chance occurrence. In this case, the person or the lady who is reminding her is the real witness. She's one, because the first has already forgotten that. So she is just taking her this liberty of reminding her, and again, which comes to the fact that there's just one lady witness who is actually testifying, because the first one had already forgotten. So the issue of this testimony of women that we have discussed in some of our previous sessions in much more detail has been unfortunately messed up. And instead of thinking that there is a certain social advice which the Quran is given, and in scenarios in which we ourselves have the choice to make a witness, is entirely different from scenarios in which a crime scene takes place, in which the person, whether a man or a woman who's present there, is a witness. These two situations cannot be regarded as analogous, and hence any rule which is construed for one cannot apply to the other.
But Dr. Shehzad, why do they say that in case of financial matters or business matters, one man is enough, but it has to be two women?
As I said, it is
I've
people.
heard this many times.
Because this is a gross misinterpretation, and because people think that way. As I said, the verse itself says that if the first lady forgets, then the second is going to remind her, which of course means that the decision of the court, if there is a problem, is going to be made on the basis of the second woman, because she is the person who reminded her, she is the decisive lady. So it's not correct to say that the witness of one man is equivalent to two women. It is just in the scenario of the Arab culture in which women were not used to coming to courts, is one woman given the help of another woman in testifying in case there is this need. And this is a commonplace misconception of in which we generally think that two women are equivalent to one man as witnesses in financial transactions.
Thank you. I understand it. Thank you.
Right. Okay, I think that we do not have any further questions as far as I can see. And so let's uh, bring an end this session, and inshallah we'll see you next Saturday on the same time. And until then, it is Khuda Hafiz.